First of all, our learning is in the merit of the speedy and healthy return of the hostages, the healing of the wounded, the comforting of the bereaved, the protection of our soldiers, the protection of all of Israel, and both in the land of Israel and outside the land of Israel. And Mashiach should come speedily and in our day. Yesterday we began, we read through the Rambam's characterization of the mitzvah of L'saper b'yetzias Mitzrayim. This is a mitzvah that specifically applies on what we call the Seder night, to tell over the story of the going out of Egypt. So when there was a Mishkan, when there was a tabernacle and a Beis HaMikdash, the actual ritual of Pesach begins on the 14th of Nisan, with the bringing of the Korban Pesach. So you're bringing the lamb to the Beis HaMikdash, and the lamb is offered as a korban, as an offering, and then representatives from the group that are going to be at the Seder bring this lamb back on a spit. So there's certain elements of the lamb that are burnt on the altar, but most of the lamb remains, and it's brought back on a spit, and then it is roasted, prepared for what is going to be the Seder night. So there is already a holiday-like atmosphere that starts a little after noon on the 14th. This is still evident a little bit in the laws of the 14th. So, for instance, there are rules that already apply on the 14th itself. In the time of the Mishkan and the Beit HaMikdash, they were bringing the offering around then, so it has already a holiday-like quality. So, for instance, there's a lot of holiday-like rules that start to take effect afternoon on the 14th. So any creative work that is not necessary for the holiday is now restricted. It's more like during the intermediate days, during Chol HaMoed, there's creative work that's not supposed to be done. Really, you're only allowed to do, I'm calling it creative work, in Hebrew it's malacha. The creative work that you're not allowed to do on a holiday, you're also not allowed to do during the intermediate days, unless it is directly connected to the joy of the holiday. So it appears like there's a lot more permitted, but really, if you pay careful attention to the laws of the intermediary days, there's really, it's meant to be mostly holiday-like, with just a little area of extra permit for things you're allowed to do for joy. And it's similar for that day. So we still have a kind of vestige of what would have been felt at the time when there was a tabernacle or a Beit HaMikdash. That day is already the beginning of what you would call Pesach. Pesach, the holiday of Passover, has been described even by scholars as a kind of hybrid. There's two themes There's the theme of Passover, which is represented by the lamb or the goat. And then there's the theme of the matzah. And so sometimes it's called Chag HaMatzot, and sometimes it's called Pesach. There are times when it's called Pesach, where it's only referring to the day where the offering is brought, and then the night that follows, where the Seder is happening. For instance, if you look at the description of the second Passover, it seems like the second Passover is mainly that. In fact, or at least the focus is mainly that, because when the people ask Moshe what they can do if they're impure, they won't be able to partake of the Pesach offering. Moshe eventually tells them that there's going to be a second Passover a month later for those people who couldn't bring the Passover offering at the first one. It's called Pesach Sheni, and that becomes the law. But it's only a one-day affair. It's only the first part, which would begin with the Pesach offering and then go through the night and include what we call the Seder. Throughout the night, they would tell the story of Egypt, and then it would end the next day. That Passover is just that. So what we experience is a kind of hybrid, and this is described in the Torah, but we experience a kind of hybrid of elements that are described in the Torah, which is initial focus on the ideas represented by the lamb or goat, and then eventually morphs into the matzah and the notion of matzah. So that first night, after they've taken care of the preparations for the offering, it moves into what we recognize as the Seder. Surveys have determined that the Seder is the most practiced Jewish ritual amongst Jews, even more than Yom Kippur. More Jews experience the Seder than any other Jewish ritual. And it's unique for many reasons, but one of them is that it's not happening in the synagogue. The Seder is happening at home with family, with an emphasis on, as we see here, the emphasis is on telling the story over to our children. The Rambam emphasizes, and so do, he's gathering it from Midrash and the Gemara, that this would be done even if there weren't children present, but clearly the Torah characterizes it as something you would tell over to your children, and primarily, if there are children there, they are meant to be the focus. And I have a friend, Rabbi Yerachmiel Yukoson. When we were students together, we lived in a Beit Vegan, which is a neighborhood of Jerusalem, and we lived down the block from Rav Moshe Shapiro, our Rebbe of blessed memory. And so Tzipi and I were already married. Rabbi Yukoson was not married yet at the time, and he asked Rav Moshe if he could come to his Seder, and Rav Moshe agreed. So the only people at the Seder were Rav Moshe's family and Yerachmiel Yukoson. And he was so thrilled and excited, but also nervous, because he expected that he is going to hear a Seder like no other, with all the deepest elements, because it was our Rebbe, and that's what he typically did with us. He opened up the world of Torah in the deepest way to us, and that's what he was expecting to have at the Seder. So I waited up. He came back afterwards, and he told me, almost disappointed, but we realized it was the deepest of lessons, that Rav Moshe, his youngest son, was at the Seder, and Rav Moshe spent the whole night just mainly directed to his youngest son. And so the whole Seder, and especially the Magid portion, which is the telling over the story, was set over in the simplest, almost childish way, so that his son could relate to it. And there was no mysticism, there was no, deep expounding on details of the Haggadah text, etc. And that became a guide for all of his students and for many others. This is the way it's supposed to be done. When there are children at the Seder, they are meant to be the focus. Even like for several years, my family and my sister's family would do the Seder together. And one of the things that has happened to the Seder is that kids are taught in school for like a month before Pesach about the Seder, and they have these little notebooks, and they have, by the time the Seder comes, they have pages and pages of things to say at the Seder. If you have several kids, my sister has 15 children, and I have 4 children, so there were, let's say, 19 children at the Seder. If you have all these kids with stuff prepared to say, the Seder goes to like 2:00. But the thing is, these kids are not necessarily hearing something new at the Seder. They've been preparing to say something at the Seder. And one of Ramosha Shapiro's favorite statements was, this is based on a kashrus thing, an Aramaic statement about kashrut. Aidi detorid liflot lo yivla. When something is busy putting out, it doesn't receive. When something is busy expressing, it can't hear. It doesn't receive. So it's an ironic circumstance that children with the best Jewish educations might be set up so they can't even hear anything that you have to say about the Seder, only what their teachers prepared them to say. Sort of an ironic thing. So my sister, after a while, my brother-in-law would run the first Seder and I'd run the second one, and I would tell the kids, you can't say anything you prepared. You can only ask a question if it's something that you're genuinely curious about now, which made it much quicker Seder. But there were precious moments where there was some real communication. There was on the first night too, even though they were doing it. Anyways, so
Rabbi,
yeah.
yeah, I just want to say I had always been bothered by the statement in Haggadah, even if we were all wise and all that knew everything, because it used to say, "What? Since when? Because you're wise, and do you not have the mitzvah? Why do you have to say that?" And I've come to believe that we the stress in that statement is on every. What if every Jew in the world, little bit, knew everything? There's still something valuable in telling it, not even learning it, but telling it over. So
in other words, I like that, because you're highlighting that the language of the mitzvah is telling it over. In other words, the benefit from telling it over,
not even teaching, because
the
we all
benefit
know
to the teacher, the benefit to
Right.
the teacher
Right.
of repeating it. Yeah, I've been listening, Lahavdil Elef Alfei Avdalos, but the Rambam says that there is wisdom amongst, he quotes the statement of the sages, there is wisdom amongst the Gentiles. But I listened to Ram Das, Richard Alpert Ram Das. There's probably 1,000 hours of recordings of him talking. So in several of the ones I've listened to, he begins by saying, he says, why am I talking to you? Like, there'll be a group of people around, and sometimes in the group there's like people with themselves with a lot of experience in the kind of stuff that he's talking about. Almost everybody that was coming to listen to him at a certain point had a lot of experience in the stuff that he was talking about. So he goes like, why am I talking to you? He said, essentially, you hired somebody to say what we already know. I'm here to say what we already know. So if we already know it, why are we here and why am I saying it? He said, because we benefit from saying it over. He said, you benefit from hearing it and I benefit from saying it.
Exactly.
Right. So, and also, yeah, so I like that. I like that you highlighted that. And I think that's true because here, if you asked, who are they talking about? They're talking about the teller of the story, that somehow it's a mitzvah to be the teller of the story. And that there's obviously some benefit to being the teller of the story. Now, in the Haggadah itself, there is some goal for this experience, that somehow in the telling of the story, we're going to, and this is what I was talking about yesterday, somehow in the telling of the story, there's a point where we get to gratitude, and that explains why Hallel is at the end of it. It's not accidentally at the end of it. It's a kind of telling over the story is meant to get there, to this point where we actually experience the gratitude. I remember, and I know people write about, the scholars write about this and talk about it, but the mitzvah, there is a mitzvah to say Hallel on the night of Passover. And to say that there's a mitzvah to say Hallel is sort of funny. It's like saying there's a mitzvah to love God. Everybody asks, how could either you love God or you don't love God? But what do you mean there's a mitzvah to love God? So here it's almost like that. There's like a mitzvah to be grateful. Either you are grateful or you're not grateful. There's a mitzvah to praise him out of gratitude. So either you are grateful or you're not grateful. Maybe you'll say, well, you might be grateful, but you're not praising him. So that might be true. But for a lot of us, we need to get to grateful. And it seems like that's part of the goal. That is, as Rabbi Alban was pointing out to me, might be the goal of telling over the story, that we're meant to get to a state of gratitude. This would very much fit your emphasis, that whether or not any data was transmitted, any new information was transmitted, ultimately we're doing this to bring ourselves to a state of gratitude, and then out of that state of gratitude to praise God. Okay. And
can I just?
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know how parenthetical it is, but they did studies where they gave a person to read a text, by scanning and reading, or to read the text aloud. They found out that when a person read something aloud, they had much more comprehension of what they had read than if they had just scanned it. And they had a lot more sympathy with the position that was advocated if they were the one that was speaking it.
Nice. So you're saying these were studies that indicated that.
Yes.
Nice. That makes a lot of sense. I remember my father was a Hill director and he used to do a lot of different programming. One time he brought in somebody who taught the Evelyn Wood speed reading. He used to do all sorts of different programming at the Hill House. So they brought in, this person came in and did an introductory session that promised to double your reading speed and increase your comprehension. And they had certain techniques. Now there, it was still scanning though. They did not advocate reading out loud, because reading out loud is going to limit you on how fast you can read. And I'm assuming that's why they didn't talk about reading out loud. But they talked about posture. They talked about using your finger to point. You use your finger to point when you're doing it. It guides you, and then you could speed up how fast your finger's moving along the lines, and then down the lines, etc. But I think that would probably be the reason why they didn't say read out loud, even though it would increase your comprehension, because they're aiming for speed reading, and speed reading wouldn't do it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that's nice. All right. So, and the emphasis here right away, and this is also an emphasized in the Haggadah. There's an emphasis here. Give me 1 second here. 1 second. 1 second. 1 second. 1 second here. I'm just going to take us downstairs for a second. Sorry about that. Okay. Yeah, so one of it emphasizes right away that you're gonna try to make this long. In other words, even though you can get through the story quicker, you wanna actually make it longer. You want to take your time with it. What he says over here, and it is better for one to add upon the telling and stretch out the words. So I like that, especially the reading out loud part, which is very much how we do the Seder. We often ask different people to read it. But certainly even when it's just a few people, and they're not necessarily asking everybody to read it, you're still reading it out loud. But I could see using the evidence that you're suggesting, that davening it may not be the best way to do it, because there's a way of reading through it where you're just doing it like davening. By the way, many people might argue that the way we do davening, in the where we tend to read very quickly, we do read it out loud, but we tend to read very quickly, may not be the best way to do it, because like you said, you get the benefit when you read it out loud. I don't think davening it would give you, when I say davening, I mean like reading it quickly. I don't think davening it would give the same benefit. I guess it would just be hard. Sephardic, if you ever go to a Sephardic minyan, the Chazan says everything out loud. And it doesn't take that much longer than an Ashkenazi minyan. But he says every word clearly, and he says it out loud. I do have friends that have made the point when they do Birkat Hamazon to say it out loud, every word carefully. And that would very much be in line with what you were talking about. And especially because Birkat Hamazon has a similar purpose, which is to encourage a person to feel gratitude, and then to praise God from a place of gratitude for what we have.
The bracha that we say on Hallel, we said likro as Hallel. Does this mean? It seems to me that that's saying that it's not. You have to do the creed. You actually should be.
Yeah.
It doesn't
to
make
call
sense.
it out, right?
Yeah.
To call it out. Yeah. All right. So the basic elements of the story that you want to underline, or here he says magnify, are the injustice and oppression that was meted upon us by the Egyptians, that God saved us, and that God avenged us In other words, that those who oppressed us punishment was meted out. This is also emphasized to Avraham in the vision of the Bris Ben Absarim, in that vision that God shows him how his descendants will end up oppressed by a foreign people. Those people will eventually be judged and will be punished, and the Jews will go out with great wealth. But that notion that there is God's vengeance, usually when that's unpacked, that notion of God's vengeance, because vengeance, we're told to not take vengeance against others, and that vengeance is wrong. But there's usually when you unpack God's vengeance, we talk about it in terms of vengeance. Even the Torah talks about it in terms of vengeance. But when you unpack it, we understand it to not be a reflection of deep anger, but rather the realization of something like measure for measure. That when and this is a principle that seems to consistently be expressed in Tanakh, which is that if a person acts in a particular way, that will be visited back upon them. It's a kind of justice. So that if a person acts kindly, kindness will be visited back on them. When a person acts or acts correctly, then goodness will be reflected back on them. But if a person acts incorrectly or with cruelty, then a punishment that is very much in keeping with what they did will be visited back on them. We Americans in Western culture use the word karma. It's not exactly what the original term means, but it's something like that. In other words, the way you act will be visited back on you. And that's how most understand it when you speak about God's vengeance, that's what we mean, because the God's not really acting out of some kind of emotion that is boiling deep within him, even though we don't understand the workings of God's inner person. But we don't believe that that's what's going on, but that it looks the same as vengeance. When somebody does something to you, God will visit that back on them. But that's, again, usually understood as a kind of justice, a measure for measure will be so. And this, just like the Egyptians drowned Jewish children, so eventually Egyptians were drowned. It's like measure for measure. Kind of thing. And God says to Moshe, I want you to tell Paro that the Jewish people are my firstborn son. If you don't let them out, I will kill your firstborn son. In other words, this is, and that's, again, it's a kind of measure for measure. It's not meant, and this is hard, and especially when we're going through what we're going through now, to step back and say this, but it's our belief, and this is something that's emphasized by the Rambam in many places. Our belief is that God is not governed by emotions, but that he is systematic, and that he has built into creation a system of justice, and a system of justice results in a kind of a like response. What you put into it is what you get out of it. So when it talks about God avenging upon us, what is important is that there is justice. Now, we don't always see the justice. In fact, we sometimes see the righteous people suffering and the wicked, successful. And this is, that question of theodicy. But and so we struggle with it, and there's all sorts of answers. There's also the world to come. There's a next world, and it's not always all being worked out here. The Gemara has different responses to this. Ramosha Chaim Luzzatto lists 10 or 12 different responses to this question, and there are some cases that are not clearly resolved. But the expectation is that there is justice. This is God's mentoring of Abraham in this next week's parasha, where God, before he tells Avram about Sodom, he makes it clear that he says, why do I know him, or why do I love him? Ki dativ, why do I know him? Why do I love him? Because he is going to teach his children the way of God. He's going to teach them tzedakah umishpat, righteousness and law and justice. So God's justice is going to be a study for Abraham. It's my understanding that that's why he's being presented with Sodom as a kind of challenge, because God is mentoring him on justice. And that's what Avram says. It would not be just. It would not be just for you to kill the righteous together with the wicked, because he's being mentored in God's justice. It's very important for man to realize, and especially the Jewish people, to realize that there is such a thing as divine justice, and to live with justice. And this explains our emphasis on studying the law. Why do we spend so much time studying the law? So you could say practically, there's no prophecy. There's not an easy way for us to connect to God. And studying the law is a way of connecting to God. And that is true. But at the basis of it is also this notion that knowing God's law is part of how he wants us to live in this world. He wants us not just to know it, he wants us to live it. And it seems like he wants us to teach it also, that what he calls tzedakah umishpat. There's a point where the Torah is characterizing the Jewish people under the rule of King David. And it seems like they want that the authors of this is in the book of Shmuel, it might be Shmuel, whoever's writing this, wants us to get a sense that there was a period, even though he has a very turbulent life, there was a period when he was king where things were as they should be. And it says that it characterizes it as he ruled the people with tzedakah mishpat, and that the nation itself was a nation with tzedakah mishpat. So this is very, very important. It's like hugely important that we realize that there is a system like that. And even if there might be exceptions that we don't understand, they need to be explained, because at the core, there is this system. So if a nation harms others, there's something that comes back on them. I once argued that even if you have the best of intentions, it comes back on you. Even if you're doing what is right, sometimes it can come back on you. So for instance, let's say with Yaakov and Esav, Yaakov takes he tricks, it seems like he tricks his father, and he gets a blessing that was supposed to go to Esav. He gets it. So let's say you argue that this was the right thing for Yaakov to do, which is how I was taught when I was a kid, and continue, to hear many, many explanations that suggest that what Yaakov did was exactly the right thing to do. Let's say you came to that conclusion. You still see Yaakov suffer for it. You could argue that there were areas where he did something wrong, and that's why he's suffering. But let's say you take the position that he did nothing wrong. He was a complete tzaddik, and he did nothing wrong. There are commentaries who suggest this. In fact, there seem to be a lot of commentaries who suggested that he did nothing wrong. Now, if you take that position that he did nothing wrong, how do you explain what comes afterwards? Because clearly he seems to suffer because of what he did. In fact, even it seems like the Torah is saying that the reason he was deceived, and now he's married to both Leah and Rachel, is because of what he did to his brother. Because there's words, Lavan says, you could say words are put in the mouth of Lavan, or Lavan says, I don't know where you come, but we don't marry off the younger one before the older one. It just seems like he must have heard those words and seen that they are reflecting back on what happened to Esav. And everything that follows afterwards, all the stuff between Yosef and his brothers, the death of Rachel, the Yosef and his brothers, all these things that happen, which he eventually characterizes to Paro as bad. He said, I had met these years were bad. Many of his years of his life were bad. So he clearly felt like he suffered, and a lot of even us who are reading the text are guided to think that he's suffering because of what he did to Esav. Now, so how could you reconcile that? How could you say that everything he did to Esav was right, and that Yaakov is still suffering because of it? So you could say that this is one of the qualities of the measures of justice, that if you do something wrong, there is a consequence, even if you're doing the wrong thing was the right thing to do. An example of this would be telling a lie. There are certain times when you're supposed to tell a lie. Even Hillel says there's certain times you're supposed to tell a lie, and we paskin like Hillel. So if what you're going to say is going to hurt somebody, you oftentimes, not every time, but you're oftentimes guided to lie. So if your aunt comes into the room and she asks you, how does she look in this new dress that she got? You would be guided to say, you look great. You look beautiful. It looks beautiful on you, even though it may not. You would be guided to do that. There's times when you're supposed to lie. We see that in this next week's parsha too, when it's according to the commentaries, God himself lies in order to protect Avram from hearing what Sarah really said. So you would be guided to lie in that case. Now, let's say your children were in the room with you when you said it. So you've taught them an important lesson, that there are times when it's the right thing to lie. But now your daughter is never going to ask you how she looks in the dress, because she knows you lie about it. In other words, there is a consequence to the lying, even though what you did was the right thing. So that's another sort of thing about this. And when you study this notion of what's justice and when justice happens, and this built-in system of justice into the world, it's just one of those things that comes up. Anyways, so that notion which is an important element of the telling over the story of the Haggadah, that notion that we should tell how God avenged us, I'm suggesting is part of that discussion. Okay, we'll continue with this tomorrow. I'm very grateful. Yeah, Mo.
So what would be enabling? You know how we discussed, like, sometimes the you have to have justice outweigh the mercy, because we were talking about, so in Yaakov's case, what would be enabling?
In other words, why is it the right thing? Which one? Why was it the
For
right
him
thing
to suffer? Meaning, like,
right.
there's no enabling with Yaakov, right?
Well, it could be. I mean, I don't know entirely. Eventually, somebody might argue there. I don't know what the Ishbitzer says about this, but he says this in general. There are certain things that we have to go through, and it's not about in a certain way. There may not. He'll say that there's not free will in this situation because something was supposed to happen, and so it could be that we are supposed to go down to you could argue that we're supposed to go down to Egypt. He's put in a situation where he's between a rock and a hard place. There's no way for him to do something that's absolutely clean, where he's not going to get blowback, but he has to pick a certain thing. This is the best one to pick. This is the right one to pick, but it's going to cause all sorts of suffering. You could argue that the suffering is going to be necessary because it's going to get us into Egypt, and we need to go to Egypt in order to be the people that we're supposed to be. There's something called Yisurim Shel Ahava, which is suffering out of love. The Gemara just mentions the concept. It doesn't explain the thinking behind the concept, but it's possible that a person suffers and they've done nothing wrong.
Right.
But maybe they're talking about this. They're talking about something like this, that God, Hashem needs something to happen. Maybe he needs compassionate people, and you're only going to be able to be compassionate if you went through the same thing they went through. So he needs people to help alcoholics get out of alcoholism. But the only kind of people that can really help an alcoholic get out of alcoholism is an alcoholic. So he needs you to become an alcoholic, go through all the hell of being an alcoholic, and then to emerge from it so that you could be there for other people. It could be something like that. So you're looking back and you're going, what was the point of all the suffering? This is what God needed. He needed me. It's something, you could say, again, this is only according to the people who say that Yaakov's behavior was perfect,
right?
Which a lot of people do. But if you say Yaakov's behavior was perfect, how do you explain the suffering afterwards? So you could say it's what we call Yisurim Shalava. Hashem needed something to happen, and there's going to be times in this world where it's going to cause you suffering because he needs something to happen.